And like, I swear that gate leg table, I'm very impressed when just every term when we have that and people draw it so nicely. I'm just like so many bobbins and oh, it's crazy. Also the cup, I think feel like the cup and vase leg too in that sort of elevated armoire cabinet is kind of crazy too because of the way that they space them out and they do the arches is hard, I think hard to draw. Now you see why I say like maybe get the lined paper or the dotted paper to kind of like space things out a little bit.
Yeah, the dotted paper definitely helped a lot with trying to draw those. It
Yeah,
took me so long to work out the legs of the table. Like it
right.
really had to look at it, but we got there.
Yeah, the lines are good and it's better than graph paper because the graph paper seems like it's too much visually. And I think I just let Amber and Gabby hi.
Hi.
We were talking about the drawings just now, like spacing them out and how the graph paper, or not the graph paper, but the dotted helps. 6, 7, 8. Oh no. Well, it's 7:21, and let's see. Anybody else want to make comments about drawings and things? Did you look at other people's drawings? I imagine you probably have.
I was super impressed with Eden's like 3D renderings. I thought that was super cool. You mentioned it last class and then I saw it posted and I was like, that's so cool.
Eden, did you answer my question? Like, how did you do that? What did you use? She's unmuting herself. One moment, please.
All right. Yeah, I just got Clip Studio Paint and I've been teaching myself how to use it. And
I don't even know what that is. That's very impressive.
It's honestly pretty good. It's a pretty good program and it's like I think it's like $50.
Is it like a vector program, kind of like Illustrator?
Well, it has vectors. You can use vectors.
Okay.
So it's like vector and raster. And it's pretty good. I wanted to have a program that I just like owned that I didn't have to like buy a subscription for.
Yeah.
So it's good for that.
That's cool. Yeah, it looks good. I mean, I like the way it does like the shading and the kind of the highlighting too.
Yeah.
Cool. Very cool. Fun. And then do you just use like a cursor or do you have like a pad, like a an
yeah,
iPad?
I have a tablet
You
computer.
have a tablet. Okay.
Yeah.
That's cool. And then you're kind of drawing freehand or are you drawing within how did you get it so?
Well, for some of them I would use the symmetrical ruler. And with others, I mean, like if you use the stabilizer, you can draw like pretty good like curves and circles and stuff.
Can you do like one half of it and then mirror it?
Yeah, I did that for the chairs.
That's a great.
Yeah.
Too bad that doesn't exist for like when you're drawing by hand. Like quite often.
I hope so much.
Because in CAD, it's like that's the best. It's like I'll design a bookcase, I'll draw half of it, and then I'll mirror the rest. I'm like, my design. Yeah. Well, cool. Let me see if there's other people. Hopefully, I'll be able to see. Okay, well, we're gonna start. And if anybody has any comments or whatever about drawing, just let me know. So I want to start talking about prehistory, but I do want to mention really quickly at the beginning of this video, just in case people watch this video later, I'm going to share my screen really quickly. And I'm going to go into really quick. I'm going to go into I just want to show you guys the module. So I opened up this week's module. So it's January 26th. I opened up this whole module. I am going to give you a quiz, but that's going to be obviously just a take home quiz. And I believe it'll give you like 3 different tries to get, a better grade on the quiz or whatever. And it's basically just testing your knowledge kind of quiz, just like a fun quiz for chapter 10. And then there's a whole bunch of stuff to read and watch and look at. So I just kind of wanted to give you like a mini tour. So, and this is always how our modules are set up. You'll have the live Zoom lecture, then you'll have the actual like lecture that I will put on this page. And then underneath the Zoom week lecture, I will have the actual lecture slides. I'll post that underneath that, similar to how I did it here, week 2, chapter 10 slides. I'll do that for week 3, chapter 1 slides. And then here I have like discovery. These are not required because whatever I have in the lecture is really the only required part of it, but it's more just discovery. So like, for example, this will have actually a video that we will watch tonight, or a couple videos that we'll watch tonight, just because I think they're really interesting, and it's nice to like finish the video and then maybe have like some chit chat and discussion about them. So here's a bunch of videos. Like there's actually an article about human body ratios. Here's a Khan Academy video that we'll watch tonight. And there's another one that I'll let you watch on your own, but it's about the Venus of Willendorf, which we will talk about. There's another video we'll watch tonight. There's one about ancient Jericho that is about a lot of ancient villages and settlements that we will not watch because it's like a 50-minute video. And then there's one on Chatal Hoyuk, which we will watch the whole thing because it's the archaeologist that was in charge of the dig, and I think it's really interesting. So those are some things to look at. And then to do for next week, I want you to read chapter 2. I want you to read the article about the myth of whiteness in classical sculpture. And I want you to read this article about erasing history and groups of people in history. I think it's fascinating. I think it's ever more important to think about whether we're thinking about taking down statues that we feel have really never served us and are actually harmful to people, or groups of people who would like to erase whole races of people or groups of people, or warring factions, clans who are against other warring factions, clans. I think it's fascinating. So don't forget to look at those. I think everybody will probably be pretty interested in that. So just to give you kind of an idea of like, there's a lot to look at, and not just, reading chapter 2. So, and the reason I'm being slow to open modules is because I'm like perfecting the course, and I had to, I think I've said this before, I had to port everything over from a different course. And so slowly but surely I'm like changing dates and things like that. And I will reiterate again, we do not have due dates for assignments. It's nice to have them done the next time or the next class period. But I'm not going to penalize anybody for like late assignments or whatever, but you do need to be your own boss in terms of don't getting too far behind, because there's a lot of drawings, and I think that I would get stressed out if I got too far behind if I were in the class. Not that you can't catch up really quickly if you put your mind to it, but it's just a matter of dealing with all of your other responsibilities and requirements that you might have that could get in the way of that. Okay, so now I am going to prep to show you my slides. Oh, whoops. It's not the way I want to do it. Okay, you should be able to see prehistory and the Stone Age. Hold on. I'm bringing Jeff in. Sorry, Jeff. I don't know how long you're out there. Hopefully not too long. Okay. I'm gonna put this. Okay. Prehistory and the Stone Age. And go. It's not going. I don't know what's happening. Oh, there we go. Okay. So the reason I do this, I start with prehistory. I I think it's really interesting. It's really interesting to think about how settlements and or living spaces, um, how they were created and who lived in them, and just learning as much as we can about how people lived. I think is really interesting, and I think it gives a a perspective just on all the periods that we'll talk about many things, that people find important about their living spaces. And I'm going to probably talk about this a lot, but I I think that learning about how people organize their homes makes us better designers, because then we know like what's truly important to be. Obviously, we know that food, shelter, um, just safety in general, getting away from the elements is very important. But then there's other things that become very important, and I just think it's fascinating. But not everybody has taken this like gone this deep in history, so I just want to have a level playing field. So what we're going to be talking about is like prehistoric architecture, basically, dwellings and art. And so we're gonna, sorry. Um, so Paleolithic period, 2 million years ago to 13,000 BC. And so Paleolithic means the old Stone Age. It's a term used to define the oldest period in human history. Um, and it's from the Greek, paleos, old, and lithos, stone. Um, so basically, the reason we call it prehistory is because no one was able to document history. So history is the act of documenting what has happened. Um, so we just have to piece together what happened with artifacts and things that were left behind. And so we'll just talk about the things that were preserved really well, luckily, in this class. And then, like I mentioned before, the book has a great timeline. And I just want to go over some of these aspects of the timeline. So when we're talking about how many years we're talking about, just so we're all understanding, the Earth is 4.5 billion years old, and our modern form of humanity is only 200,000 years old. So we're just sort of a speck here. And why do we count backwards? So we don't know the exact age of the Earth. So scientists use a point in time. And it was basically the birth of Christ that they used as a 0 point, and the years progressed from there to the present, and then we count backwards. Um, and it's like how scales are used, so like pressure, temperature, elevation. And then you'll see sometimes that people use rulers or heads of government to mark time as well. And in furniture, it's no different. And sometimes it can get confusing in furniture because there's regency periods in different countries. And this is how the timeline, you can read the timeline. So we've got the time period, we've got the years, we've got the types of humans, we've got different terms that we're going to be using. So this should be pretty self-explanatory looking at it once you understand the year, how we're counting the years. And then, so the first thing we'll talk about is just the Paleolithic really quickly. Humans began leaving Africa in 70,000 BCE, and BCE means before Common Era. And I'm sure a lot of you, oh, Morgan's here, hold on. Hi, Morgan. We're starting the Paleolithic, so you haven't missed much. So I'm sure most of you know what a nomadic culture is. So they don't have a permanent home. They wander, they hunt, they gather, they live in temporary dwellings, and then they move if it gets cold or the herds move, they move with it. So they're not an agrarian society, meaning they don't grow their own food. They just go where the food is. And they traveled in groups. Now, when you think about traveling in groups, you're traveling with your family or a clan. So not a whole bunch of people like outside your like inner circle. You're with like a group of people that you know very, very well, foraging for edible medicinal plants. And as I said, like lived in caves or temporary shelters. And then the tools that they had were made of stone, hence the Stone Age. And they made very sharp axes and cutting tools. Here's some of them. And then this stone is just an example of a tool that can break the flakes off or chip a piece of stone in order to make and sharpen a tool. So here's one of the first artifacts that we'll talk about. So this is 24,000 to around 22,000 BCE. And this is called the Venus of Willendorf. So this is definitely something to remember. This is a very like important icon. What is really interesting about it is that it's about 4.5 inches tall. So it's a lot of detail packed into like this little totem, basically, is what it is. And it's obviously a woman. And actually, she has her very thin hands over her chest. So she's resting them on her chest. Those are her hands. So they're like not anatomically correct. It's really kind of interesting. And what's on her head is open for debate. It could be her hair. It could be some sort of like head wrap or hat type of item. People have talked about seeing like traces of color on that textured headpiece or hair. It was discovered in 1908, and there's no way to know the context. They don't know if this was because they were idolizing fertile women. Clearly they were, but under what context, not really sure. So but it is a very interesting artifact. And then there's some other artifacts that I just wanted to show you so you can kind of get an idea of the style things were done in. I want to play this video because I think it's really interesting to think about not necessarily the state of mind that people would be in, but the sort of the cognitive and like maybe the like the thought process going on between like the relationship between man, women, and animals. I think it's really interesting. So I'm going to play that.
August 1939. Two men are hurriedly digging at the back of a German cave. Suddenly, they make a heart-stopping discovery. Tiny fragments of mammoth ivory, worked by prehistoric human hands. But there's no time to investigate. Europe is about to go to war, and both men have been called up to fight. Decades pass before the fragments from the cave can finally be pieced together. And what then emerges is extraordinary. A figure of a being that cannot exist in nature. He stands upright on human legs, with human arms at his sides. but his torso shades into a strangely strong, thick neck, and then into the head of a lion. This lion man, crafted 40,000 years ago, comes from a world that exists only in our imagination. Yet he is here, and his pricked up ears are listening to us, his eyes watching us. Who or what the lion man was, we shall never know. But the answer mattered enough that a small community living on the edge of subsistence, haunted by what lurked outside their cave, mammoths, lions, let somebody spend 400 precious hours carving this figure, carving out a story that was told by generation after generation around their fire, so that the lion man's torso became smooth as he was passed between them. These people possessed something precious, a shared story, which showed each person their deep connection to one another, to the dead and the as yet unborn, and gave them a place in this world and the worlds beyond. That story, whatever it was, ended up buried in fragments. But tens of thousands of years later, here we are, as much in need as they were of a shared story that pieces us all together and shows us the stake that we have in one another's lives, helping us to face together whatever lurks outside the cave.
There is actually, oh, here it is.
There are over 4,000 religions existing in the world, and 85% of the world's people are considered to be believers. And through time and across the world, we have no knowledge of a society that doesn't have beliefs. Seems to be a natural characteristic, a product of our hugely inventive minds, that we communicate with beings and worlds beyond nature. As fully modern people, we go back 100,000 years, and certainly we recognize in the archaeological record from Africa and from Southeast Asia and Australasia, really ancient things that show the modern human species beginning to symbolize thoughts. The oldest object that we have, which shows us very clearly that we are having a conversation with something that does not exist in nature, is the figure of the lion man. The lion man is made of mammoth ivory. This is the biggest animal in the late Ice Age environment. The fiercest animal in the environment was the cave lion, bigger than a modern African lion, without a mane, a huge, fierce creature. What the sculptor who made the lion man has done is to combine the mammoth, the lion, and the human. So we have human legs and a groin, the navel in the correct place for a human being. And then as you come up the body, come into these immensely broad and strong shoulders and a head, the head of a lion, made with such naturalism that we can see that he's watching, that he's listening. The little furrow behind his ear is the furrow created as the muscles tense for the ear to be turned and alert while listening. His eyes are looking forward and his mouth in this extraordinary grin. This combination of human and animal features, this alertness, this participation, suggests that there's a conversation going on here, a conversation of a human who is so much part of nature, but wears clothes, makes tools, has fire, but yet is in awe of this fierce lion from whom it's important to protect oneself, but also to admire. This is a really important conversation happening here. Now, I can't say whether this sculpture represents an avatar or a deity or a creation story. None of that really matters. What matters is this conversation, this sign of mind, and this sign of using a belief in beings and worlds beyond nature that help us to get by, that help us to give us meaning and understanding and to overcome the things that frighten us, but also to share stories with one another around the fire. And we know this has happened with the Lion Man because his body is polished by the wear of being passed from hand to hand. And he's found in a cave, Stadel Cave, not far from Ulm in Baden-Württemberg. Deep in its recesses, the Lion Man was carefully put away after sharing stories around the fire, bonding, socializing, planning for tomorrow, thinking about the possibilities. So it shows beliefs in other worlds, in other beings, being a really important part for social cohesion and for confidence of human beings to have meaning and carry on with their lives.
I think my favorite thing that she says in that video is she talks about how making that lion man symbolizes the thought process. And you don't really get a lot of what the thought process was, but I mean, I guess the act of creating something that is, outside of, reality seems like a pretty interesting thought. So yeah, it's fascinating. So another thing I want to show you about sort of creating art in around animals are the caves at Lascaux. And this is really one of the finest examples of artistic creations made by the Paleolithic humans. So it was discovered in 1940 in France by four young boys were playing with their dog, and they went into these caves and they found these caves, huge caves, just painted with all kinds of animals. And then these caves were like a sensation and were open to the public for years and years and years. But then the tromping through of people were damaging the paintings. So then they had to create like a reproduction, and they created one like a museum that has the exact reproduction that you can tour. And I've never been, but if anybody has, let me know. We can talk about it, or if you have pictures. But they are just really beautiful. Hold on, I'm going to see if there's anybody in the waiting room. I don't think anybody is. Okay. They're really, really beautiful. Just the super sophisticated artistic ability of whoever did this. They use the undulations of the cave to create the perspective and the depth. And apparently they were made from water, pigment, and animal fat. And I've been watching like several videos, and one guy is reproducing like how they may have done it, and he basically puts like charred wood or something, like ashes, in his mouth, chews it up, gets it to a consistency, and then basically blows it very hard onto the surface of the rock, and that's how they say they were done. It was basically like airbrushing, and that's pretty much how it kind of looks. I mean, I'm sure it's not all done in that exact way, but it's a really, really
From about
interesting.
18,000
And
until 10,000 BC,
I'm going to show you this
long
video right
before
now.
Stonehenge and the pyramid.
Hold on.
Skeleton.
And don't be mad. He says like doodads in this, which I think is bizarre, but Rick
From
Steves,
about 18,000
what are you
until
gonna do?
10,000 BC, long before Stonehenge and the pyramids, back when mammoths and saber-toothed cats still roamed the earth, prehistoric people painted deep inside caves in this part of Europe. These weren't just crude doodles, but huge and sophisticated projects executed by artists and supported by an impressive culture, the Magdalenians. The region's limestone cliffs, honeycombed with painted caves, are unique on this planet. Tourists gather nearby at Lascaux, home of the region's and the world's most famous cave paintings. These caves were discovered accidentally in 1940 by 4 kids and their dog. Over the next couple decades, about 1 million visitors climbed through the prehistoric wonderland, inadvertently tracking in fungus on their shoes and changing the humidity and the temperature with their breathing. In just 15 years, the precious art deteriorated more than in the 15,000 years before that. The caves were closed to the public. Visitors can now experience the wonder of Lascaux by touring an adjacent replica. When their time comes, visitors are called to meet their
church. They never lived in the caves. And it's a huge composition. It's a calculated composition because they have taken advantage of a strip of rock to relate in a circle 2 groups of bulls facing each other. And in the center of this composition, they have united the 3 principal animals of Lascaux: horse, ox, and deer.
Is this a hunting scene?
No, it's not a hunting scene because on the walls, the hunter doesn't exist. They never tell the everyday life. The meaning is more complex.
What is the biggest animal?
Is this bull? Is the largest painting in the cave art, 16 feet from the top of the horn to the tip of the tail.
The guide explains that this 600-animal multi-cave composition was the work of a complex society, the Magdalenians. Their culture allowed for skilled artists to work over an extended period of time in this sacred place.
They fix maybe on the walls a dream, a myth, a knowledge, and the image will be able to across generations. The image becomes the memory of the society. The art of Lascaux is supposed to be around 17,000 years old. But compared to the beginning of the humanity, which was born in Africa 3 million years ago, Lascaux, it was yesterday. They were like us.
The region has many more examples of prehistoric cave painting, and the nearby National Museum of Prehistory provides an instructive background. This modern museum houses over 18,000 bones, stones, and fascinating little doodads, all uncovered locally. Artifacts are originals and show that while the Magdalenian people lived 15,000 years ago, they were far more advanced than your textbook cavemen. Skeletons were discovered draped in delicate jewelry. Stag teeth and tiny shells were, it seems, lovingly drilled to be strung into necklaces. These barbed spearheads and fishhooks would work well today. Finely carved spear throwers show impressive realism for something 3 times as old as the oldest pyramids. Imagine flickering flames from these oil lamps lighting those art-covered caverns. Today, as we ponder the prehistoric caves and the artifacts of the Magdalenian people here in the Dordogne, we can marvel at how much we actually have in common with these people and how sophisticated their culture was so long ago.
Good old Rick Steves and his doodads. Hold
From
on.
a
Anyway, this is a very sophisticated art, very beautiful and interesting to think about the culture that, you know, um, valued this and created it. Here's some more images. I mean, I'm amazed at just the shading and the sort of the texture of this. And I find it really interesting when you compare it to other things like Egyptian, where there really isn't a lot, and also Greek too, there really isn't a lot of perspective going on at all. And the figures are very flat, the style is very flat, so it's just really interesting to me how this has so much, it's so loose and fluid, and you really get a feeling about the movement, um, and it's not at all flat or static, so that's what I think that is a really cool aspect of this art. um, so there is the reason it was able to be, you know, preserved for so long is because the conditions were just very dry, which is the case for Egypt as well. And the substrate was very porous, so it kind of like, you know, sucked up the color and the pigment. And there's also evidence that they used scaffolding to create this, and that there's, you know, a bit of mysticism or ritual involved. Um, so it's amazing.
That guide was funny.
Rick Steves. Okay,
Yeah.
so
Well, the European guy was like, no, it's not a hunting scene. There's not a hunter. He's like, you dumb American. Like,
right, and it's funny too how he was almost about to say something like super interesting, and Rick's like, which is the biggest one? I want to see the biggest one. Like, well, just use your eyes to see the biggest one. I know, he's really funny. So here we go to the Mesolithic period real quick, a couple thousand years. So Meso's middle, so we're in the middle Stone Age. There is more understanding of how to cultivate plants on purpose. So that helps people, also makes them want to stay in one place more, and also return to the same areas at the same times of year. And they start using domesticating animals and using them for hunting help, and then also raising them for food. Um, and then those shelters become more substantial. They start making things out of mud bricks. And then the tools become slightly more sophisticated. And so one of the earliest actual settlements. So this is, when we think about a settlement, we're not just talking about the clan or the family or the like extended family. We're talking about a group of people that have settled together on purpose, and trust each other enough. And this is in near Jerusalem. Jericho is in near Jerusalem, and north of the Dead Sea. And the settlement, I'm going to go through these slides a little bit and then we'll go back to the video. Oh, whoops. Stop. So the settlement is seemingly, according to the archaeologist, randomly arranged. So there's no, it's sort of like you moved in, we're making it your dwelling, then the other dwelling. And so it's not a huge amount of like city planning or anything like that. But it is a community. They are cooperating, which is brand new. There's actually stone foundations, and you can even see them. And many of you maybe are aware of the Bible story of the walls of Jericho. There's actually a tower in Jericho as well. They're not quite sure what the tower is used for. It could have been a granary, you know, something to store food that they were raising. So there's a stone foundation, but then they used mud bricks. Also, the use of plaster. And then they found stone tools, stone vessels. So they would make, like, carve into, similar to those candles that he was showing in the video earlier. So those like little oil lamps. So they would make even more of a depression to make the vessels. And this was so early, pottery didn't even exist. So there's no pottery that they found at all here. Here is an image of the style of the bricks. And I really haven't been able to research, like, what is that image? To me, it almost looks like a plant image, like two leaves sort of sprouting out, or wheat or something like that, which I don't know. But to me, that's sort of the way it looks. I think it's interesting that, you know, humans would even want to decorate the brick as well. I think that's really cool. And then there are walls, obviously, walls of Jericho. And then some really fascinating things that they would do is that they would bury their dead under platforms. And this must have been some sort of burial ritual. So they were fine with the dead being, you know, buried under their, like, seating areas or platforms in their homes. The skulls would be covered in plaster, and then they would adorn those skulls and the eye sockets, you know, with shells or stones, because, you know, maybe they just wanted to have it as lifelike, you know, as possible. There's a lot of theories floating around why they would do that. And then moving into the Neolithic. So that's, Neo means new, 6,500 to 3,000 BCE. So settlements become even more permanent as they become adept at raising crops and domesticating animals. And then the civilizations become more planned, more thought out, and more permanent, and working together cooperatively to create order, not just in your families, but thinking about, how do you create that order? Who decides? This is fascinating to me. Like, who would decide how things looked? There is decisions being made because they start to do things the same way in each living dwelling. So to think about coming together, creating a living dwelling, like, you know, I think about if I got like 50 people together, like, we couldn't all decide how your house was going to look. Like, it's just really interesting to me that it was very uniform across all the dwelling units. I'll show you. So obviously this cooperation created more access to food, safety, and shelter, and then the population was allowed to increase, and then you have more and more dwellings. And then you could use, they use stone tools, and then started to use metal tools. So Çatalhöyük, which is in Turkey, it's 6,500 to 5,700 BCE. So this was, I believe, this was a couple of thousand years that people, several generations, lived in this settlement. And what is really interesting about this settlement, and you notice from this picture that it's in tiers. It's tiered. So they have different floors. But what would happen is the first floor was created, then people lived in it, and they didn't build outwardly necessarily, they just kept building up. So and when they, let's say they were at the first level, the way to access other people's homes was not to walk around or on a street or go through a wall or a hole in the wall, a door or anything like that. It was to walk up through the roof and then come back down on a ladder. So the only access into the home was from the roof. And then basically the town square became the roof because it was all, that was the way people circulated. So in Çatalhöyük, you get the first surviving examples of art, decoration, and accessories. So this is like interior design, it's architecture, it's art, it's daily life. And because it was built in these tiers, it was really well preserved. So all they had to do, and they could compare 1,000 years to 1,000 years before. So the arrangement is very intentional. There are stone foundations. They use the same, type of mud bricks as they do in Jericho. They plaster their walls, and they don't just do it once. They do it again and again and again. So they want to keep things clean, and they want to make sure that the soot and everything is cleaned off. So they have a lot of intentionality about how they want their homes to be. And then they find tons of pottery, very small figurines like that Venus of Willendorf, like little totems or amulet items in the walls, buried in the walls, buried in the floor. So they had some sort of meaning for the family, for people, and then they would eventually, put them in the wall. Maybe they kept them in the wall. Not really sure. They also found cloth, which had not been found. So they found those buried deep in. And then there were also these really interesting raised platforms that are a part of like a special part of the home that isn't used a lot. It was probably used for like somewhat ceremonial purposes. And then the single family dwellings, as I mentioned, were built in several layers. And I think the highest of which were like 65 feet high. So from the beginning to the top, there was 65 feet. If you think about, I wonder how many that was. So it's like you probably about each floor would probably be about 7 feet. I'm just guessing. So maybe that's nine layers of dwellings, just a rough estimation. So this is sort of like an aerial drawing of what it may have looked like. So you would just walk on the top and access your next dwelling that you might want to go to. So no street sidewalks, it's clustered. Access is through the roof holes. Roof is used for communal spaces, and you kind of get an idea. This is just a little illustration of what it could have been like there. So new dwellings were built on top of homes, and the earlier dwellings were burials. So those were used not for new people to move in. Those were somewhat sacred places that were completely sealed up, and then the next dwelling was built on top of it. But sometimes people from another level would go down to gather body parts of the previously buried or deceased in order to then bury a body part with someone who had deceased up above, possibly a loved one that they wanted the newly deceased person to be buried with. They're not sure, but the social structure, from what they can tell, is pretty egalitarian. There weren't any sort of cells or very special neighborhoods that were known for one kind of thing, like one kind of food or one kind of art. It's all spread out. They think that elders held status. And they don't think that there was really a whole lot of difference between what men did and what women did, or their status, which is pretty interesting. And oh, whoops. So one of the interesting things about the planned community part of it was that in the south part of each dwelling, they would have the I believe it was the hearth, and you would have like the access from the roof. So they all were laid out the same exact way, which is really interesting. And oh, whoops, sorry. And then lot of different types of art. Like this type of art wasn't everywhere, but it was repeated. And again, you can see that there's like a plaster technique. There's a light colored plaster. And then there would be a lot of like relief sculptures on walls, and then actual animal horns or skulls on walls. This was one of the figurines, very similar, right, to the Venus of Willendorf. So, a lot of similar things, ideas about, fertility. Obviously, a woman who had, had many, many children. So there's something about that, the I don't want to say idolization, but it's, like a celebration probably of, fertility and long life. And I think it's really interesting how there's these sort of leopards or panthers that she's clearly sitting on something. And to me, it looks like an armchair that has decorative arms that are panthers, but there was not any sign of any type of furniture, any type of throne or you know furniture of this type. So I think this is fascinating, that this is just from someone's imagination, and it's not just this person, it's repeated sort of motif. So this person held in the imagination some kind of status. And what you tend to see as things go forward and furniture starts being used, that status and seating is very important. And the hierarchies between people of different status and the type of furniture that they're allowed to sit in is super, super important. And I think as a designer, knowing that and understanding that is super fascinating. So here's some platforms, like examples of the platforms, and also these three-dimensional relief sculptures that you see. It's like an incomplete image, but you definitely see there's something, maybe with horns or ears or something. Clearly something was here and maybe got, pulled out or decayed. But here you see, the horns of a bull. And these then were wild animals. And I've been reading this really interesting sort of report or paper about the dig for Çatalhöyük, and they didn't necessarily eat these animals. So these weren't animals were eaten, they were just animals that somehow had some sort of power for them, and they wanted in their interiors for whatever reason, we don't know. But when they do the studies of things that people ate, it's like domesticated animals like goats and sheep and things like that. It's not these wild animals, which I think is fascinating. So they found lots of things, wild animal parts, skulls, teeth, beaks, tusks, horns that they would use and put in the house or in the dwelling. And then all kinds of different imagery and styles in these places. And so the animal symbolism is super important. And then I'm going to go back to that video. And we can watch that. This is the archaeologist that was in charge of the dig.
So I'm going to talk about Çatalhöyük. I'm aware that many of you, or most of you, nearly all of you, are not archaeologists, know very little about archaeology. So I'm going to use this as a way of introducing you to the site, but also to some of the ways in which archaeologists work and some of the problems that they have in trying to make sense of very ancient data. So Çatalhöyük is in central Turkey. It's in that group in the middle, just here. And it's part of a number of sites that are known throughout the Middle East of about this same time period. And it was first excavated by someone called James Mellart in the 1960s. And he discovered this very large settlement where the houses were all packed together so that there were no streets. And so people had to move over the roofs of the houses in order to get into the building. So people walked on the roofs and then went down a ladder into the houses. And inside the houses, people lived, but they also buried their dead beneath the floors. There was also a lot of art and symbolism that Mellart found in the 60s. So the site became very famous internationally because it seemed very weird, you know, this idea of being on the roofs of houses and burying the dead in the houses and so on. But there were some controversies, some scandals that took place in the mid-1960s, and that project ended, and there was no work at Çatalhöyük until we started there in 1993. And we have excavated in two areas of Çatalhöyük. We've excavated on this east mound. There are two mounds. This is the east mound, and we worked in that northern area and in the southern area. In the northern area, we've been trying to understand how the site was organized at any one moment in time. How were the people organized? How was the political, the social, and the economic aspects of life? How were they all organized at this site? It's a very big site, perhaps 8,000 people lived there at one time. So how was it possible to organize so many people? We've also excavated in the south area, where what we're trying to do is rather different. Here we're trying to understand the development of the site over time. There is about over 1,000 years of occupation, people living in a house, then filling it in and building another house on top and another house on top and another house on top. So the mound gradually grows higher. And so in the end, it is 21 meters high. And so this gives us an opportunity to look at the ways in which society has developed and changed through time. I want to tell you a little bit about how over the 25 years of the project, the nature of the project has changed. One of the changes has just been that the size of the project has increased. When we first started in the early 90s, we had a very small team, as you see on the top. And in recent years, the team has been about 160 people, of which 120 or so were sometimes there at one time. So the team has got much larger and the project much more complex. And one of the ways that it's become more complex is in how we work. When we started excavation, we recorded on paper, as most archaeologists do. But through time, we've gradually introduced more digital methods. And so by the end, we were recording everything on tablets and in the field making 3D reconstructions and also working in a 3D immersive environment. Another way that the project has changed is that all archaeology needs to work with different stakeholders, different partners who work together around the heritage table. And this gives you some idea of the different sorts of stakeholders who have to participate in the work that we do at Çatalhöyük. And so, for example, it's been very important to work with educational programs to involve children from the area around Çatalhöyük and indeed from the whole of Turkey in learning about Çatalhöyük, but also in learning about archaeology. And we have been involved in training projects where people from the local community have been learning how to protect and conserve the ancient remains at Çatalhöyük. And so this has been a very big part of what the project has wanted to do, to participate with communities. But it also shows the difficulties because in recent years, the Turkish government has decided that it does not like this type of work. And so it has stopped all community engagement. And we no longer have the possibility to go into the local villages and to participate. So this is another, in my view, sad development that's occurred over time. So that gives you some idea of the background of what we've been doing and how methods have changed. And what I want to do in this talk is to look at 5 questions. These are questions or problems that many people have written about Çatalhöyük. And I want to show you how our ideas about these questions have changed over time. And in doing so, to tell you a little bit about how archaeologists work and how they solve problems. So first of all, I'm going to look at questions about landscape and the environment. Secondly, things to do with burial, how the houses were used, how society was organized, and one of the most fascinating aspects of Çatalhöyük, what was the role of women 9,000 years ago. So to start off then with landscape and the environment. So this is an image of what we used to think Çatalhöyük looked like in its landscape 9,000 years ago. We thought it was a landscape which was very flooded every year. It was a very wet land. And because we had this image, which derived from work by sedimentologists and soil specialists of various sorts, we realized that it was not possible for this large community. This is one of the disadvantages of being outside. So it's very difficult to have this large community in a wetland environment, because where would you put the agricultural fields? We knew from our study of the crops that we recovered from the archaeological deposits that people were growing their crops on dry land. So where were they able to grow their crops? And so we decided that they had to be moving about 12 kilometers away from Çatalhöyük to where there was some higher dry land. So that was our first idea. But when we had a new team of sedimentologists and soil scientists, they decided they didn't like this idea. And they did a whole series of new studies. And they did lots and lots of coring through the landscape around Çatalhöyük. So much more detailed analysis of the ancient soils that were buried around Çatalhöyük. And what that showed was that, in fact, the environment around Çatalhöyük was much more varied than we had thought before. There was much more undulation, much more changes in height of the land. And then, in fact, there was not a flood, but a sort of dendritic pattern of streams, rather like in these modern examples. And so they now argue that the fields, this is the time of Çatalhöyük, the fields that, that supported the village or the town were all local, but in these higher areas between the fields. So this is an example of how if you do some initial coring, some initial analysis, you can very easily get the wrong picture. And that by doing much more intensive work on a finer scale with a larger input of resources and funds, you can get a much finer grained pattern that changes the argument. And so now we believe that the fields that were being tilled by the agriculturalists at Çatalhöyük were local, very near the site. So the second problem or issue that I want to talk to you about is burial. I told you before that people were buried inside the houses. And this is some of the excavation of Melart in the 1960s. And you can see this great jumble of bones, human bones, that he found beneath the floors of the houses. And in the wall paintings from the site, this is an example of one of the buildings at Çatalhöyük. In the wall paintings, you see these images of headless bodies, and some of these bodies have no heads. So here you have headless bodies, and you have what he interpreted as vultures, these large carnivorous birds that pick the flesh off corpses. So he thought that these bones had been produced by the bodies being left out. They put the bodies outside the settlement, and then the vultures, these big birds, came and they took the flesh and they left the bones, and then people collected the bones and put them in this jumbled mess underneath the floors of the houses. So this is what Mellart thought in the 1960s. When we started our work in the 90s, we began to get a very different picture. For example, we often found complete bodies in their own graves, or pairs of bodies in graves. And when we studied these jumbles, these messes of bones very carefully, we realized that what was actually going on was that whole bodies with their flesh on were being placed in pits beneath the house floors. So this is the floor of the house here. So people would dig a hole beneath the floor and they would put in a completely fleshed, normal human body. And then they would close the grave. And then later, they would dig another hole when a new person died and put a new body in. And they would disturb and move away the earlier bodies. So you end up with a jumble, a mixing of bones. But in fact, the process is one of putting wholly fleshed, complete bodies in the graves and then disturbing them later. And in fact, we gave up the idea of vultures taking off the flesh of the bodies. What we did find was that in some cases, there was very specific removal of parts of the bodies. So for example, here is a body we excavated, and you can see that the head is missing. And in this other grave, we have a female skeleton who is holding another female head, which has been plastered to make the facial features. It's difficult to see, but this is a reconstruction. The facial, the nose and the face has been reconstructed. So we think this was removed from another woman's body. We think it was kept for quite a long time because it was replastered many times. We think it was kept for a long time. Then when this woman died, this skull was placed inside her grave in this very sort of a close relationship. So we do know that although bodies were mostly put in graves with all their flesh on, that at times the heads were removed and circulated and then buried at a later time. But we also have other examples where the head is present, but the arms and the legs are missing. So again, we think that part of the body is buried, but then the legs and the arms are circulated around in the village. So if you went to Çatalhöyük, if you went into a house 9,000 years ago, you would meet real people alive, but you will also meet parts of bodies, skulls and other parts of bodies that would be in the house. People would have a very, very close relationship with the dead, with the ancestors. They would live with them and keep them alive in some way in the society. So this is an example of how our ideas have changed as we have developed new, more careful techniques. The third question I want to look at is the use of houses. So when James Mellart in the 1960s excavated these types of buildings with their very elaborate bull's heads and other types of symbolism, he thought that he had dug up what he called a priestly quarter. That's a part of the site where the priests live, the ritual leaders. And he made a separation between these types of houses, which were the houses of the priests, the religious elite, and domestic houses, ordinary everyday houses. So he wanted to see the society at Çatalhöyük divided between the everyday secular domestic houses and the special shrines, and he called these things shrines. But when we started doing our work, we realized that something was really wrong. And what was wrong was that in all the houses, we found a lot of evidence, but very microscopic, of daily activities. And we mainly discovered this through using a technique called micromorphology, which involves taking very, very thin sections through the deposits and looking at them under a high-powered microscope in order to identify the very, very fine layering and different types of materials that are getting placed in the ground. So for example, here you have a building we excavated at Çatalhöyük, and here you can see the micromorphological slides from the different parts of the floor in the building. And what they show is that all in different parts of the floors, there are deposits of reeds for making mats, of material that is raked out from the hearths and the ovens, the processing of plant remains, lots and lots of different types of tool production, so that these houses were clearly lived in, even the most elaborate, the most priestly-like in Mellart's terms. And also on the walls, under a microscope, we could find hundreds of layers of very fine plaster, as people had perhaps monthly or seasonally replastered the walls of their houses. And in doing so, they trapped traces of activity. For example, soot from the fire. We found the traces of the soot, the black charcoal material from the fire that was deposited on the wall that they would then whiten over, and then more soot would deposit, and then they would whiten them over again. So there was lots and lots of evidence that we had from Çatalhöyük, from these houses, that all of the houses were used for everyday activity, even though they cleaned the houses very carefully. Another way that we did this was by taking lots and lots of samples and sieving them and sorting them very carefully to find the micro artifacts and to find how they were distributed in the buildings. And we could also look at some buildings which were burned, and there was a special type of deposition. And this showed us that there was a very clear pattern at Çatalhöyük, which was that in the southern parts of the house, you have the oven and the hearth, and most of the daily activities, producing what we call a dirty floor. So this is the main sort of production and storage area. And then as you move northwards in the house, you go onto whiter, higher platforms under which people are buried, and which there is most of the different types of symbolism. So for us, what we feel is that all the houses have some degree of daily use, and all the houses have some degree of ritual and symbolism. So you cannot separate at Çatalhöyük everyday life from religious life, except in the house itself. There is a distinction between the everyday practical activities here and the more symbolic aspects to do with death and wild animals in the northern part. And because my voice is running out, I'm just going to show you a little video. So this is a reconstruction of one of the more elaborate buildings at Çatalhöyük. And the point that we're trying to make is that in the southern part of the house, you have the oven and the hearth. You have the ladder entry coming in from the roof. So the smoke from the hearth and from the oven would go out through that hole. You have a ladder going into a side room or a storage room. So this is the sort of dirty daily activity area with pots as well. And as you move northwards into the house, the floors are cleaner and they are higher sometimes, these nice platforms under which people are buried. And then you have bull's horns, and we think this is an image of a bear that was placed on the wall that was very important in the symbolism of Çatalhöyük. So the idea of this reconstruction is to show you that integration of the different types of life at Çatalhöyük. So we're very clear then that at Çatalhöyük there are that all houses are used for both domestic life and ritual, and there is no real separation. And in fact, at Çatalhöyük there is no evidence of a ritual center, a ceremonial center, or any other type of central function. All there is at Çatalhöyük is lots and lots of houses and some areas of refuse or open spaces. There is nothing else. So that leads to the question is, how was society organized? As I said, there were about 8,000 people packed together. How was it possible to organize so many people if there is no main center of any sort? There's no ritual center. There is also no political center, no administrative buildings, and nothing except houses and open areas. So how was society organized? We've already seen that some of the buildings are really quite elaborate, like these ones. And I want to talk a little bit about this type of more elaborate building. One of the things that we've been able to do in the southern part of our excavations is to look at the development of houses over time. And we have this very clear evidence that very often a house was lived in for 50 to 100 years, then it was filled in, and then another house was built, but with exactly the same sort of pattern, the layout of the walls, the hearth and the oven on the south end, that was then filled in, and then another house built on top. And this can happen up to 6 or 7 times in a long sequence. And what is more, we find that there's some repetition. So for example, this is a house with pairs of leopards looking at each other. This house was then filled in, and then that house was built on top. And another pair of leopards was placed in exactly the same place, but higher up as the house was moved upwards. So this suggests.
I just want to stop for a second and just, comment, which I'm sure you noticed. I find this amazing that there are 3 different interpretations of these paired leopards. And I think it's so interesting. I don't know if it has to do with like a family tradition or what was going on, but I think that is fascinating, because maybe what you would think would happen would be that you would just, do a reproduction and maybe do it exactly the same way, but they didn't do that. They did it completely differently, yet all the structures are laid out the exact same way in the same direction, facing the same. So that is just fascinating to me, how you can have this artistic interpretation, yet stick to this sort of coded community plan. Anyway.
It's a very strong sense of memory, of continuity. And we have lots and lots of examples of this type of continuity. But these buildings that last a long time are often the more elaborate buildings. And by elaborate, I mean that they have more of this type of symbolism in them, of bull's horns and leopards and other types of symbolism. A lot of it is to do with wild animals of various sorts. So this is an example of a platform in one of the buildings. This is in the north part of the house, as usual. The platform, a higher platform with white plaster floors, with bull's horns around it. Up there was that's a calf, a young bull head with horns that have been removed, and there was some painting on the wall there and some other aspects of this. So it's a very, very elaborate, symbolically rich part of the house. And when we excavated this platform, we found very many burials. And this is a pattern that we find over and over again at Chatov, that there's a close relationship between the buildings with most ritual symbolism and the buildings with most burials. Some of the houses have 62 people buried beneath the floors. So these houses with many burials are also the houses which have most symbolism. And I'm sorry to show you a graph, but this shows you the total number of individuals who were buried in a house on the left. And this is an index of how symbolically elaborate the house is. And you can see that this correlation between how elaborate a house is and how many people are buried. So it seems that at Çatalhöyük, there are some buildings that that are special in the sense that they have more ritual and symbolism in them. And they also seem to be the houses into which people are buried from other houses. So people are buried preferentially into these important central buildings. And these buildings often endure for a long period of time. And I have come to call these buildings history houses. They are buildings in which there is a great concern with ancestors, with looking after the dead, and with rituals that protect the dead in some way. So you could argue that at Çatalhöyük there was a religious elite, that there were a group of people or a group of houses in which there were ritual specialists who cared for the dead and who also cared for many of the symbols that are associated with Çatalhöyük. But what's interesting is that this elite, this special group of houses, was not able to change or convert that type of status of the control of ritual into real economic status. And we can see this by looking at another graph, which looks at how elaborate the building is compared with the amount of storage space or activity space in the building. And what you see here is that there is no correlation at all. So it is not the case that.
And just to clarify what he's talking about how these history houses that had the most burials, it didn't necessarily equate that they had a higher economic status or were richer in some way, because their storage space was not bigger, did not contain, anything that would be of value that they could trade or give them higher status.
That the more elaborate buildings with more burials were able to convert their control of ritual into the control of storage or other aspects of production. So for us, this may seem a very strange idea, that you can have a society that is organized and run by people who have a lot of ritual and religious status, and perhaps social status, but do not have economic power and do not control force, because there is no force to control at Çatalhöyük. So this is a society that's organized, but not in a way that we recognize. It's a very different type of system. Just some other aspects about social organization. It does seem, you might think that there would be neighborhoods or groups of houses that work together in some way, in small groups or neighborhoods. But this is not something that we've been able to find. And I want to show you this by looking at this particular building, which has been quite well preserved. This is the storage room to the south. This is the oven, sorry, and the hearth. This is the ladder coming down here. This is the south end of the house. And as you move northwards, you get to the white platforms. There was some burning here, so it looks a bit black, but these white platforms under which people were buried. This is a burial platform, and on the wall here, we found this geometric painting. This is the sort of work that Gesualdo is studying. And this is what the overall painting looked like. And you can see that it has vertical lines, some of which are missing. And then it has triangles against the lines. And then it has this brick pattern, this pattern filling in of bricks. So it's what we call bricks. So it's quite a distinctive design. And you would think, well, maybe nearby houses have similar design. But in fact, there is another house with a very similar design. You can see with the vertical lines and the triangles and the brick pattern, but it is as far away as you can get in the excavated area from the first one. This is the one I first showed you, and that's the second one. And we find this with all the different types of symbolism at Çatalhöyük, that if you try to connect houses that have similar art or similar ritual, they just don't form neighborhoods. And so, in my view, Çatalhöyük was a very, very complicated society with very, very many complex cross-cutting links. People are linked together in clans and medicine societies, hunting societies, all sorts of different societies that connected people through this. But that the main way that the society was organized was through perhaps committees, groups of elder ritual leaders who were able to control the processes of burial and of other types of rituals, and who in particular controlled the way that these types of activities were expressed in each individual house. Because you remember I said each house inside has the same pattern of the south and the north, the dirty and the clean, and the sort of everyday and the sort of more ritual. So this was a code, a sort of code that was somehow spread through the society and controlled by these ritual leaders who, as I said, did this without the control of the economy and without the control of force. So finally, what about the role of women in all this? And Çatalhöyük is very famous for this particular image, which is supposedly shows a woman sitting on a throne of leopards with her hands on the heads of the leopards. And some people argue that she is giving birth here as well. So this image has been used to argue that Çatalhöyük was organized through something like a mother goddess cult. So when we started to work at Çatalhöyük, we certainly found that in the upper levels of the site, there were quite a lot of images of women. And as the team working on the figurines studied these more, they began to feel that that these were not actually women who were young and fertile, but were actually very often older women who had sagging breasts and sagging stomachs and sagging bottoms. These were sort of middle-aged to older women. Some of them, these are beautiful, really beautiful stone figurines. But really, these are of images of women who are, you know, perhaps had a long life of childbearing and whatever. But the emphasis seems to be on age rather than anything else. And this is very interesting. Some of these female figurines are placed in very special positions. For example, they're placed on the floor of a platform before the platform is remade. So they're somehow protecting the floor or the house, or they're doing something in a very special way. And sorry, there's another graph, but one of the things that archaeologists are now able to do is to study the bones of the skeletons to see what people were eating, to get a sense of the diet of people 9,000 years ago. And here we're looking at nitrogen, which is telling us about how much meat people were eating, and carbon, which is telling us about what different types of plants people were eating. And I don't know if you can see it clearly, but the open symbols are of young people, and they occur across to this part of the diagram. The young people are eating these types of plants. And on the right here, you have the middle-aged and the older adults. So there is some overlap, but there's actually a clear difference between the younger people and the middle-aged and older people. And this is our first clear indication that older people at Çatalhöyük, middle-aged and older people at Çatalhöyük had a special diet, and diet is often an indication of status. And so Çatalhöyük seems to be a society that was organized by age. And I said before how I think that a group of elders was in control of Çatalhöyük. But what's very important is that these elders included both men and women. If you try to break this down by male and female, there is no difference between the diet of men and women. They have identical diets. Also, if you look at the wear and the activities on the body through people's lives, you see that both men and women are doing identical jobs. They don't have different tasks in life. And perhaps most important, I showed you how the heads of important people were taken and kept and then reburied. And we think that these heads were of important people. And there are just as many female heads as there are male heads. So you could have female status in the same way that you could have male status. So our evidence suggests that Çatalhöyük was a society divided to some degree by age, but not by gender. It seems to be a society that's relatively blind to whether you're a male or a female in terms of what job you do or what sort of social status you can have. So that's it. Thank you very much.
He's very abrupt with his endings. Anyway, I think that's fascinating, both in what they discovered and also like what they're able to figure out in terms of all of the analysis that they do, the food, the burials, and I mean, you know, you think about the idea of home and the idea of, you know, holding on to those people that were precious to you and the past, and really literally having the past live with you and you live on top of it, is fascinating to me, that this is how they lived and how they, and the fact that they went to all the trouble to create new living dwellings on top of old living dwellings. So it's like, obviously that old living dwelling with the burials and the people living in it was, you know, such a place of, you know, sacredness that nobody else could live in it, and it was done, and then they'd have to, you know, build a new life on right on top of it. So I mean, I think that's fascinating. I think that might be all that I have tonight, you guys. Oh, so basically the big takeaway. So here's some really interesting images. We saw some harpoons. I don't know that we saw bone needles, but these are fascinating, tiny, little carved bone needles with even tiny, tiny little, the eye of the needles. Some pottery, some really nicely made pottery with like, you can still see the color on it. You can still see the texture. You know, probably this was like a water jug. And then this is an example of a very like, you know, small scrap of cloth, you know, a cloth remnant. So the takeaways that I want you to have is in this and all periods, I want you to pay attention to hierarchies. So when he was talking about the history homes, those homes that were um, used by people with, you know, slightly higher status, that maybe had the ritualistic, you know, the elders of the society. Pay attention to those kind of hierarchies because they indicate people of higher status, but also thinking about design and how you can imbue your spaces with hierarchies. Your public spaces can have different doors on it, different entrances, different ways. And when you're laying out a space and you're starting from scratch, you can use those ideas in order to create different feelings of grandeur, of casualness, of, you know, you can run the gamut. So there's also paying attention to the evidence of status levels of various people or groups, and also understanding that you might do that, and to try to stop yourself from doing it if that's not something that you should be doing, is having that sort of self-awareness. Um, and then something that I think is interesting, the special areas or repeated areas. Repetition is very important. Symmetry is very important, but those special or repeated areas shared by several dwellings is really interesting, and it defines style really when you think about it, or trends or periods. Um, Common practices, community practices that seem to span communities or groups of people. And then where does art happen? How does it happen? Who does it? Then, as we move through history, who has access to it? Because that's very important. Because right now, everybody has access to making art or seeing art or having art. But then as we go further, art becomes a commodity. And this is what he was talking about, how there's really not in Çatalhöyük, not really a sense of belonging and having like an economic status and who gets what. Nobody was siphoning off, you know, all the valuable art or anything like that. Everybody, it was egalitarian and everybody had it. But then just notice as we go further that when you want to show off how wealthy you are, you pull out your art, you know, or you gather art, or you, in order to show your military prowess, um, you have a lot of fancy, expensive art, and you want to show other cultures or other countries that you have it. So those are things I want you to be thinking about, and I think this illustrates, or you know, begins the illustration of all of those things. And I'll keep talking about it, you know, whenever it's valid. But be noticing that. So I think that's it for tonight. Does anybody have any like comments or questions or anything?
I had something I wanted to say.
Oh yeah, go ahead.
About the way that all of the like layouts of the homes were all the same. I thought that was really interesting because you know, like in mosque architecture, like all like the original like hippo style mosques where it's like a big courtyard. Those are all based off of like Muhammad's house. And I think it's kind of interesting that there's sort of this like prototypical dwelling that is like echoed and repeated. And it's kind of interesting to think that that was like connected to like the spirituality of it, like recreating like an important space is like
Right,
is
it
kind of
had
like
power.
a common, yeah, but it's like a common like human thing to like repeat things. And I think it's kind of interesting. It's like recreating the same dwelling over and over again.
Right.
I don't know.
Yeah, I mean, I think it has like a power to it, and it also has like a comfort to it.
Yeah.
You know? Yeah.
I thought that was interesting.
It is. It is really interesting. Anybody else? Well, okay. I will I'm available if you have questions. So the only thing that we have is just, a bunch of reading. We have no other assignment for next week except for the quiz, which I'll try to put it up tonight. But I might not be able to, but I'll do an announcement once I do it. So that's really, besides the reading, that's the only other assignment. Okay. All right. Well, I'll let you guys go. Have a good night.
All right, thank you. Good night.
Yeah.
Thanks. Bye.
Thank you.
Close.